This is StoryLink Radio. The professional storytellers at StoryLink Radio have been around for a long time. The Irish knew storytellers by the name Shawnee. We are committed to bringing stories to life through the spoken word as in traditional oral storytelling. We present stories of many genres: ancient myths and legends, short stories, full-length novels, science fiction, high fantasy, philosophy, traditions, classics, drama, fiction, non-fiction, romance, theater, ghosts and haunts, stories of the strange, and much, much more. Our stories may be drawn from contemporary sources or from some dusty, near-forgotten tome. Regardless, it is a treat like no other to listen to stories and tales presented in a live format with the emotion and feeling a true professional storyteller brings, conjuring up images of yesterday, tomorrow, and fantasy. So join us at StoryLink Radio and let us be your Shawnee for a time. Our stories are presented before a live audience, then recorded for the StoryLink Radio podcast for your on-demand listening pleasure. Please visit StoryLinkRadio.com for show notes, to find out how to join our live audience, and for lots of free stuff, including free audiobooks and much more. Visit www.storylinkradio.com. Tonight we present The Stone Age, Part 2. The First Horseman. In the days before Ugh-lomi killed the great cave bear, there was little trouble between the horses and men. Indeed, they lived apart. The men in the river swamps and thickets, the horses on the wide, grassy uplands between the chestnuts and the pines. Now sometimes a pony would come straying into the clogging marshes to make a flint-hacked meal, and sometimes the tribe would find one, the kill of a lion, and drive off the jackals, and feast heartily while the sun was high. Now these horses of the old time were clumsy as the fetlock and dun-colored, with a rough tail and a big head. They came every springtime northwestward into the country, after the swallows and before the hippopotami, as the grass on the wide downland stretches grew long. They came only in small bodies thus far, each herd, a stallion and 2 or 3 mares and a foal or so, having its own stretch of country. And they went again when the chestnut trees were yellow and the wolves came down the Wealden Mountains. Now it was their custom to graze right out in the open, going into cover only in the heat of the day. They avoided the long stretches of thorn and beechwood, preferring an isolated group of trees, void of ambuscade, so that it was hard to come upon them and ambush them. They were never fighters. Their heels and teeth were for one another. But in the clear country, once they were started, no living thing came near them, though perhaps the elephant might have done so, had he felt the need. And in those days, man seemed a harmless thing enough. No whisper of prophetic intelligence told the species of the terrible slavery that was to come, of the whip and spur and bearing rein, the clumsy load, the slippery street, the insufficient food, the knacker's yard, that was to one day replace the wide grassland and the freedom of the earth. Now down in the way marshes, Ugh-lomi and Eudena had never seen the horses closely, but now they saw them every day as the 2 of them raided out from their lair on the ledge in the gorge, raiding together in search of food. They had returned to the ledge after the killing of Andu, for of the she-bear they were not afraid. The she-bear had become afraid of them, and when she winded them, she went aside. The 2 went together everywhere, for since they had left the tribe, Eudena was not so much Ugh-lomi's woman as his mate. She learnt to hunt even. She was indeed a marvelous woman. He would lie for hours watching a beast or planning catches in that shock head of his, and she would stray beside him. Ah, a wonderful woman. At the top of the cliff was an open grassy lawn, and then beechwoods, and going through the beechwoods one came to the edge of the rolling grass expanse and in sight of the horses. Now here on the edge of the wood in the bracken were the rabbit burrows, and here among the fronds Eudena and Ugh-lomi would lie with their throwing stones ready until the little people came out to nibble and play in the sunset. And while Eudena would sit, a silent figure of watchfulness, regarding the burrows, Ugh-lomi's eyes were ever away across the greensward at those wonderful grazing strangers. In a dim way, Ugh-lomi appreciated their grace and their supple nimbleness. As the sun declined in the evening time and the heat of the day passed, they would become active, would start chasing one another, neighing, dodging, shaking their manes, coming round in great curves, sometimes so close that the pounding of the turf sounded like hurried thunder. It looked so fine that Ugh-lomi wanted to join in badly, and sometimes one would roll over on the turf, kicking 4 hooves heavenward, which seemed formidable, and was certainly much less alluring. Dim imaginings ran through Ugh-lomi's mind as he watched, by virtue of which 2 rabbits lived all the longer. And sleeping, his brains were clearer and bolder, for that was the way in those days. Ugh-lomi came near the horses. He dreamt and fought, smiting stone against hoof. But then the horses changed to men, or at least to men with horses' heads, and he awoke in a cold sweat of terror. Yet the next day in the morning, as the horses were grazing, one of the mares whinnied, and they saw Ugh-lomi coming up the wind. They all stopped their eating and watched him. Ugh-lomi was not coming towards them, but strolling obliquely across the open, looking at anything in the world but horses. He had struck 3 fern fronds into the mat of his hair, giving him a remarkable appearance, and he walked very slowly. "What's up now?" said the master horse, who was capable but inexperienced. "Oh, it looks more like the first half of an animal than anything else in the world," he said. "4 legs and no hind." "It's one of those pink monkey things, said the eldest mare. "They're sort of a river monkey. They're quite common on the plains." Ugh-lomi continued his oblique advance. The eldest mare was struck with the want of motive in his proceedings. "Fool," said the eldest mare, in a quick, conclusive way she had. She resumed her grazing. The master horse and the second mare followed suit. "Oh, look, he's nearer," said the foal with a stripe. One of the younger foals made uneasy movements. Ugh-lomi squatted down and sat regarding the horses fixedly. In a little while he was satisfied that they meant neither flight nor hostilities. Ugh-lomi began to consider his next procedure. He did not feel anxious to kill, but he had his axe with him, and the spirit of sport was upon him. How would one kill one of these creatures? These great, beautiful creatures. Eudena, watching him with a fearful admiration from the cover of the bracken, saw him presently go on all 4s and so proceed again. But the horses preferred him a biped to a quadruped, and the master horse threw up his head and gave the word to move. Ugh-lomi thought they're off for good, but after a minute's gallop, they came round in a wide curve and stood winding him. Then, as a rise in the ground hid him, they tailed out, the master horse leading and approaching him spirally. He was as ignorant of the possibilities of a horse as they were of his, and at this stage it would seem he funked. He knew this kind of stalking would make red deer or buffalo charge if it was persisted in. At any rate, Eudena saw him jump up and come walking towards her with the fern plumes held in his hand. She stood up, and he grinned to show the whole thing was an immense lark, and that what he had done was just what he had planned to do from the very beginning. So that incident ended. But he was very thoughtful all that day. The next day, this foolish, drab creature with a leonine mane, instead of going about the grazing or hunting he was made for, was prowling around the horses again. The eldest mare was all for silent contempt. "I suppose he wants to learn something from us," she said, "and let him." The next day he was at it again. The master horse decided he meant absolutely nothing. But as a matter of fact, Ugh-lomi, the first of men to feel that curious spell of the horse that binds us even to this day, meant a great deal indeed. He admired them unreservedly. There was a rudiment of the snob in him, I am afraid, and he wanted to be near these beautifully curved animals. Then here were vague conceptions of a kill. If only they'd let him come near them. But they drew the line, he found, at 50 yards. If he came nearer than that, they moved off, with dignity. I suppose it was the way he had blinded Andu that made him think of leaping on the back of one of them. But though Eudena after a time came out in the open too, and they did some unobtrusive stalking, well, things, for the moment, stopped there. And then, one memorable day, a new idea came to Ugh-lomi. The horse looks down and level, but he does not look up. No animals look up. They have too much common sense. It was only that fantastic creature man could waste his wits skyward. Ugh-lomi made no philosophical deductions, but he perceived the thing was so. So he spent a weary day in the beach that stood in the open while Eudena stalked. Usually the horses went into the shade in the heat of the afternoon. But that day the sky was overcast, and it would not, in spite of Eudena's solicitude. It was 2 days after that Ugh-lomi had his desire. The day was blazing hot. The multiplying flies asserted themselves. The horses stopped grazing before midday and came into the shadow below him and stood in couples, nose to tail, flapping. Now the master horse, by virtue of his heels, came closest to the tree. And suddenly there was a rustle and a creak and a thud. Then a sharp, chipped flint bit him on the cheek. The master horse stumbled, came on one knee, rose to his feet, and was off like the wind. The air was full of the whirl of limbs, the prance of hooves, the snorts of alarm. Ugh-lomi was pitched a foot in the air, came down again, up again. His stomach was hit violently, and then his knees got a grip of something between them. He found himself clutching with knees, feet, hands, careering violently with extraordinary oscillation through the air. His axe gone heaven knows whither. "Hold tight," said Mother Instinct to Ugh-lomi, and he did. He was aware of a lot of coarse hair in his face, some of it between his teeth, and of green turf streaming past in front of his eyes. He saw the shoulder of the master horse, vast and sleek, with the muscles flowing swiftly under the skin. He perceived that his arms were round the neck, and that the violent jerkings he experienced had a sort of rhythm to them. And then he was in the midst of a wild rush of tree stems, and then there were fronds of bracken about, and then more open turf, then a stream of pebbles rushing past, little pebbles flying sideways athwart the stream from the blow of the swift hoofs. Ugh-lomi began to feel frightfully sick and giddy, but he was not the stuff to leave go simply because he was uncomfortable. He dared not leave his grip, and he tried to make himself more comfortable. He released his hug on the neck, gripping the mane instead. He slipped his knees forward, pushing back, came into a sitting position where the quarters broadened. It was nervous work, but he managed it, and at last he was fairly seated astride, breathless indeed and uncertain, but with that frightful pounding of his body at any rate relieved. Slowly the fragments of Ugh-lomi's mind got into order again. The pace seemed to him terrific, but a kind of exultation was beginning to oust his first frantic terror. The air rushed by, sweet and wonderful. The rhythm of the hooves changed and broke up and returned into itself again. They were on turf now, a wide glade, and the beech trees 100 yards away on either side, and a succulent band of green, starred with pink blossom and shot with silver water here and there, meandered down the middle. Far off was a glimpse of blue valley, far away. The exultation grew. This was man's first taste of pace. Then came a wide space, dappled with flying fallow deer scattering this way and that, and then a couple of jackals, mistaking Ugh-lomi for a lion, came hurrying after him. When they saw that it was not a lion, they still came on out of curiosity. On galloped the horse, with his one idea of escape, and after him the jackals, with pricked ears and quickly barked remarks. "Which kills which? Which kills? It's the horse being killed, yeah," said the second. They gave the howl of following, and the horse answered it as a horse answers nowadays to the spur. On they rushed, a little tornado through the quiet day, putting up startled birds, sending a dozen unexpected things darting to cover, raising a myriad of indignant dung flies, smashing little blossoms, flowering complacently back into their parental turf. Trees again, then splash, splash across a torrent. Then a hare shot out of a tuft of grass under the very hoofs of the master horse, and the jackals left them incontinently. And so presently they broke into the open again, a wide expanse of turfy hillside, in the very fellow of the grassy downs that fall northward nowadays from the Epsom stand. The first hot bolt of the master horse was long since over. He was falling into a measured trot, and Ugh-lomi, albeit bruised exceedingly and quite uncertain of the future, was in a state of glorious enjoyment. And now came a new development. The pace broke again. The master horse came round on a short curve and stopped dead. Ugh-lomi became alert. He wished he had a flint, but the throwing flint he had carried in a thong about his waist was, like the axe, oh, heaven knows where. The master horse turned his head, and Ugh-lomi became aware of an eye and teeth. He whipped his leg into a position of security and hit at the cheek with his fist. Then the head went down and somewhere out of existence, apparently, and the back he was sitting on flew up into a dome. Ugh-lomi became a thing of instinct again, strictly prehensile. He held by knees and feet. His head seemed a little sliding toward the turf. His fingers were twisted into the shock of mane, and the rough hair of the horse saved him. The gradient he was on lowered again, and then whoop, said Ugh-lomi, astonished. The slant was the other way up, but Ugh-lomi was 1,000 generations nearer the primordial than man. No monkey could have held on better, and the lion had been training the horse for countless generations against the tactics of rolling and rearing back. But he kicked like a master and buck-jumped rather neatly. In 5 minutes, Ugh-lomi lived a lifetime. If he came off, the horse would kill him. He felt assured of that. Then the master horse decided to stick to his old tactics again, and suddenly went off at a gallop. He headed down the slope, taking the steep places at a rush, swerving neither to right nor to left. And as they rode on, the wide expanse of valley sank out of sight behind the approaching skirmishes of oak and hawthorn. They skirted a sudden hollow with the pool of a spring, rank weeds, and silver bushes. The ground grew softer and the grass taller, and on the right-hand side and the left came the scattered bushes of May, still splashed with belated blossoms. Presently the bushes thickened until they lashed at the passing riders, and little flashes and gouts of blood came out on horse and man. Then the way opened again. And then came a wonderful adventure. A sudden squeal of unreasonable anger rose amidst the bushes, the squeal of some creature bitterly wronged. And crashing after them appeared a big gray-blue shape. It was Ya-ah, the big-horned rhinoceros, in one of those fits of fury of his, charging full tilt after the manner of his kind. He had been startled at his feeding, and someone, it did not matter who, was to be ripped and trampled therefore. He was bearing down on them from the left, with his wicked little red eye, and his great horn down, and his little tail like a jury mast behind him. For a minute, Ugh-lomi was minded to slip off and dodge, and then behold, the staccato of the hoofs grew swifter, and the rhinoceros and his stumpy, hurrying little legs seemed to slide out of the back corner of Ugh-lomi's eye. In 2 minutes, they were through the bushes of May and out in the open, going fast. For a space he could hear the ponderous paces in pursuit receding behind him, and then it was just as if Ya-ah had not lost his temper, as if Ya-ah had never existed. The pace never faltered. On they rode and on. Ugh-lomi was now all exultation. Now to exult in those days was to insult. "Yaha, yaha, big nose, he said, trying to crane back and see some remote speck of his pursuer. "Why don't you carry your smiting stone in your fist? Bah! Ugh-lomi ended with a frantic whoop. But that whoop was unfortunate, for coming close to the ear of the horse and being quite unexpected, it startled the stallion extremely. He shied violently. Ugh-lomi suddenly found himself uncomfortable again. He was hanging onto the horse he found by one arm and one knee. The rest of that ride was honorable, but unpleasant. The view was chiefly of blue sky, and that was combined with the most unpleasant physical sensations. Finally, a bush of thorn lashed him, and he let go. Ugh-lomi hit the ground with his cheek and shoulder, and then, after a complicated and extraordinarily rapid movement, hit it again with the end of his backbone. He saw splashes and sparks of light and color. The ground seemed bouncing about just like the horse had done. Then he found he was sitting on the turf, 6 yards beyond the bush. In front of him was a space of grass, growing greener and greener, and a number of human beings in the distance. And the horse was going round at a smart gallop quite a long way off to the right. These human beings were on the opposite side of the river, some still in the water, but they were all running away as hard as they could go. The advent of a monster that took to pieces was not the sort of novelty they cared for. For quite a minute, Ugh-lomi sat regarding them in a purely spectacular spirit. The bend of the river, the knoll among the reeds and the royal fern, the thin streams of smoke going up to heaven, were all perfectly familiar to Ugh-lomi. This was the squatting place of the sons of Uya, from whom he had fled with Eudena, and whom he had waylaid in the chestnut woods and killed with the first axe. Ugh-lomi rose to his feet, still dazed from his fall, and as he did so, the scattering fugitives turned and regarded him. Some pointed to the receding horse and chattered. He walked slowly towards them, staring. He forgot the horse. He forgot his own bruises, and the growing interest of this encounter. There were fewer of them than there had been. He supposed the others must have hid. The heap of fern or the night fire was not so high. By the flint heaps should have sat Wa'u. Then he remembered that he had killed Wa'u. Suddenly brought back to his familiar scene. The gorge and the bears and Eudena seemed things remote, things dreamt of. Ugh-lomi stopped at the bank and stood regarding the tribe. His mathematical abilities were of the slightest, certainly, but it was certain that there were fewer now. The men might be away, but there were fewer women and children. He gave the shout of homecoming. His quarrel had been with Uya and Wa'u, not with the others. "Children of Uya!" he cried. They answered his name, a little fearfully because of the strange way he had come. For a space they spoke together. Then an old woman lifted a shrill voice and answered him. "Our Lord is a lion." Ugh-lomi did not understand that saying. They answered him again, several together. "Uya comes again. He comes as a lion. Our Lord is a lion. He comes at night. He slays whom he will. But none other may slay us, Ugh-lomi. None other may slay us." Still Ugh-lomi did not understand. "Our Lord is a lion. He speaks no more to men." Ugh-lomi stood regarding them. He had had dreams. He knew that though he had killed Uya, Uya still existed. And now they told him Uya was a lion. The shriveled old woman, the mistress of the fire-minders, suddenly turned and spoke softly to those next to her. She was a very old woman indeed. She had been the first of Uya's wives, and he had let her live beyond the age to which it is seemly a person should live. She had been cunning from the first, cunning to please Uya and to get food, and now she was great in counsel. She spoke softly, and Ugh-lomi watched her shriveled form across the river with a curious distaste. Then she called aloud, "Come over to us, Ugh-lomi. Come!" A girl suddenly lifted up her voice. "Come over to us, Ugh-lomi." And they all began crying, "Come over to us, Ugh-lomi. Come, come." It was strange how their manner changed after the old woman called. He stood quite still watching them. It was pleasant to be called, and the girl who had called first was a pretty one, but she made him think of Eudena. "Come over to us, Ugh-lomi," they cried. And the voice of the shriveled old woman rose above them all. At the sound of her voice, his hesitation returned. He stood on the river bank. Ugh-lomi. Ugh, the thinker, with his thoughts slowly taking shape. Presently one and then another paused to see what he would do. He was minded to go back. He was minded not to. Suddenly his fear, or his caution, got the upper hand. Without answering them, Ugh-lomi turned away and walked back towards the distant thorn trees the way he had come. Forthwith, the whole tribe started crying to him again very eagerly. He hesitated and turned. But then he went on. Then he turned again, then once again, regarding them with troubled eyes as they called. The last time he took 2 paces back before his fear stopped him. They saw him stop once more, and suddenly shake his head, and vanish among the hawthorn trees. Then all the women and children lifted up their voices together and called to him in one last vain effort. Far down the river, the reeds were stirring in the breeze, where, convenient for his new sort of feeding, the old lion, who had taken to man-eating, had his lair. The old woman turned her face that way and pointed to the hawthorn thickets. "Uya!" she screamed. "There goes thine enemy! There goes thine enemy! Uya! Why do you devour us nightly? We have tried to snare him. There goes thine enemy, Uya!" But the lion, who had preyed upon the tribe, was taking his siesta. A weem-a-wep, near the village, the quiet village, the lion sleeps tonight. The old woman's cry went unheard. That day he had dined on one of the plumper girls, and his mood was a comfortable placidity. He really did not understand that he was Uya, or that Ugh-lomi was his enemy. And so it was that Ugh-lomi rode the horse, and heard first of Uya the lion, who had taken the place of Uya the master, and was eating up the tribe. And as Ugh-lomi hurried back to the gorge, his mind was no longer full of the horse, but of the thought that Uya was still alive, to slay or be slain. And over again he saw the shrunken band of women, children, crying that Uya was a lion. Uya was a lion. And presently, fearing the twilight night come upon him, Ugh-lomi began running. Uya the lion. Now the old lion was in luck. The tribe had a certain pride in their ruler, but that was all the satisfaction they got out of it. He came the very night that Ugh-lomi killed Uya the cunning, and so it was that they named him Uya. It was the old woman, the fire-minder, who first named him Uya. A shower had lowered the fires to a glow and made the night dark. And as they conversed together and peered at one another in that darkness, and wondered fearfully what Uya would do to them in their dreams now that he was dead, they heard the mounting reverberations of the lion's roar close at hand. And then everything was still. They held their breath so that almost the only sounds were the patter of the rain and a hiss of the raindrops in the ashes. And then, after an interminable time, a crash and a shriek of fear and a growling. They sprang to their feet, shouting, screaming, running this way and that, but brands would not burn, and in a minute the victim was being dragged away through the ferns. It was Urk, the brother of Wa'u. And so the lion came. The ferns were still wet from the rain the next night, and he came and he took Click with the red hair. That sufficed for 2 nights. And then in the dark, between the moons, he came 3 nights, night after night, and that, though they had good fires. He was an old lion with stumpy teeth, but very silent and very cool. He knew of fires before. These were not the first of mankind that had ministered to his old age. The 3rd night he came between the outer fire and the inner, and he leapt the flint heap, and he pulled down the son of Urk, who had seemed like to be the leader. That was a dreadful night, because they lit great flares of fern and ran screaming, and the lion missed his hold of By the glare of the fire they saw struggle up and run a little way towards them, and then the lion in 2 bounds had him down again. That was the last of And so fear came, and all the delight of spring passed out of their lives. Already there were 5 gone out of the tribe, and 4 nights added 3 more to that number. Food-seeking became spiritless. None knew who might go next. And all day the women toiled, even the favorite women, gathering litter and sticks for the night fires, and the hunters hunted ill. In the warm springtime hunger came again as though it was still winter. The tribe might have moved, had they had a leader, but they had no leader, and none knew where to go that the lion could not follow them. And so the old lion waxed fat, and thanked heaven for the race of men. 2 of the children and a youth died while the moon was still new, and then it was the shriveled old fire-minder first bethought herself in a dream of Eudena and Ugh-lomi, in the way of Uya had been slain. She had lived in fear of Uya all her days, and now she lived in fear of the lion. That Ugh-lomi could kill Uya for good, Ugh-lomi, whom she had seen born, was impossible. It was Uya still seeking his enemy. And then came the strange return of Ugh-lomi, a wonderful animal seen galloping far across the river, that suddenly changed into 2 animals, a horse and a man. Following this portent, the vision of Ugh-lomi on the farther bank of the river. Yes, it was all plain to her. Uya was punishing them, because they had not hunted down Ugh-lomi and Eudena. The men came straggling back to the chances of the night while the sun was still golden in the sky. They were received with the story of Ugh-lomi. She went across the river with them and showed them his spoor hesitating on the farther bank. Sis, the tracker, knew the feet for Ugh-lomi's. "Uya needs Ugh-lomi," cried the old woman, standing on the left of the bend, a gesticulating figure of flaring bronze in the sunset. Her cries were strange sounds, flitting to and fro on the borderland of speech, but this was the sense they carried.
The lion needs Eudena. He comes night after night, seeking Eudena and Ugh-lomi. When he cannot find Eudena and Ugh-lomi, he grows angry and he kills. Hunt Eudena and Ugh-lomi. Eudena, whom he pursued, and Ugh-lomi, for whom he gave the death word. Hunt Eudena and Ugh-lomi.
She turned to the distant reed bed, as sometimes she had turned to Uya in his life.
Is it not so, my lord?
She cried. And, as if in answer, the tall reeds bowed before the breath of wind. Far into the twilight, the sound of hacking was heard from the squatting places. It was the men sharpening their ashen spears against the hunting of the morrow, and in the night, early before the moon rose, the lion came and took the girl of Sis, the tracker. In the morning before the sun had risen, Sis, the tracker, and the lad, Wa'u-ha'u, who now chipped the flints, and One Eye, and Bo, the snail-eater, the two red-haired men, and Catskin and Snake, all the men that were left alive of the sons of Uya, taking their ash spears and their smiting stones, and with throwing stones in the beast-paw bags, started forth upon the trail of Ugh-lomi through the hawthorn thickets, where Ya'a, the rhinoceros, and his brothers were feeding, and up the bare downland towards the beechwoods. Yes, that night the fires burnt high and fierce, as the waxing moon set, and the lion left the crouching women and children in peace. The next day, while the sun was still high, the hunters returned. All save One Eye, who lay dead with a smashed skull at the foot of the ledge. When Ugh-lomi came back that evening from stalking the horses, he found the vultures already busy over him. And with them, the hunters brought Eudena, bruised and wounded, but alive. That had been the strange order of the shriveled old woman, that she was to be brought alive.
She is no kill for us. She is for Uya, the lion.
Eudena's hands were tied with thongs, and she came weary and drooping, her hair over her eyes matted with blood. They walked about her, and ever and again the snail-eater, whose name she had given, would laugh and strike her with his ashen spear. And after he had struck her with his spear, he would look over his shoulder like one who had done a overbold deed. The others, too, looked over their shoulders ever and again, and all were in a hurry, save Eudena. When the old woman saw them coming, she cried aloud with joy. They made Eudena cross the river with her hands tied, although the current was strong, and when she slipped, the old woman screamed, first with joy, and then for fear she might be drowned. When they had dragged Eudena to shore, she could not stand for a time, albeit they beat her sore. So they let her sit with her feet touching the water, and her eyes staring before her, and her face set, whatever they might do or say. All the tribe came down to the squatting place, even curly little Ha-ha, who as yet could scarcely toddle, and stood staring at Eudena and the old woman, as now we would stare at some strange wounded beast and its captor. The old woman tore off the necklace of Uya that was about Eudena's neck, and put it on herself. She had, after all, been the first to wear it. And then she tore at Eudena's hair, and took a spear from Sis, and beat her with all her might. And when she had vented the warmth of her heart on the girl, she looked closely into her face. Eudena's eyes were closed, and her features were set, and she lay so still that for a moment the old woman feared she was dead, until her nostrils quivered. At that the old woman slapped her face and laughed, and gave the spear to Sis again, and went a little way off from her and began to talk and jeer at her after her manner. The old woman had more words than any in the tribe, and her talk was a terrible thing to hear. Sometimes she screamed and moaned incoherently, and sometimes the shape of her guttural cries was a mere phantom of thoughts. But she conveyed to Eudena, nevertheless, much of the things that were yet to come, of the lion, and of the torment he would do her.
Ah, and Ugh-lomi, ha 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 ha! Ugh-lomi was slain.
And suddenly, Eudena's eyes opened, and she sat up again, and her look met the old woman's fair and level. "No," she said slowly, like one trying to remember.
I did not see my Ugh-lomi slain. I did not see my Ugh-lomi slain. Tell her,
cried the old woman.
Tell her, he that killed him, tell her how Ugh-lomi was slain.
She looked, and all the women and children there looked from man to man. None answered her. They stood shamefaced.
Tell her,
said the old woman. The men looked at one another. Eudena's face suddenly lit.
Tell her,
Eudena said.
Tell her, mighty men. Tell her of the killing of my Ugh-lomi.
The old woman rose and struck her sharply across her mouth. We could not find Ugh-lomi, said Sis the tracker slowly. Who hunts two kills none. Then Eudena's heart leapt, but she kept her face hard. It was well, for the old woman looked at her sharply with murder in her eyes. Then the old woman turned her tongue upon the men because they had feared to go on after Ugh-lomi. She dreaded no one now Uya was slain. She scolded them as one scolds children, and they scowled at her and began to accuse one another, until suddenly Sis, the tracker, raised his voice and bade her hold her peace. And so, when the sun was setting, they took Eudena and went, though their hearts sank within them, along the trail the old lion had made in the reeds. All the men went together. At one place was a group of alders, and here they hastily bound Eudena where the lion might find her when he came abroad in the twilight, and having done so, they hurried back until they were near the squatting place again. Then they stopped. Sis stopped first and looked back again at the alders. They could see her head even from the squatting place, a little black shock under the limbs of the larger tree. That was as well. All the women and children stood watching upon the crest of the mound, and the old woman stood and screamed for the lion to take her whom he sought, and counseled him on the torments he might do her. Eudena was very weary now, stunned by beatings and fatigue and sorrow, and only the fear of the thing that was still to come upheld her. The sun was broad and blood-red between the stems of the distant chestnuts, and the west was all on fire. The evening breeze had died to a warm tranquillity. The air was full of midge swarms. The fish in the river hard by would leap at times, and now and again a cockchafer would drone through the air. Out of the corner of her eye, Eudena could see a part of the squatting knoll, and little figures standing and staring at her. And, a very little sound but very clear, she could hear the beating of the firestone. Dark and near to her, and very still was the reed-fringed thicket of the lair. Presently the firestone ceased. She looked for the sun, and found he had gone, and overhead and growing brighter was the waxing moon. She looked towards the thicket of the lair, seeking shapes in the reeds. Then suddenly she began to wriggle and wriggle, weeping and calling upon Ugh-lomi. Yes, but Ugh-lomi was far away. When they saw her head moving with her struggles, they shouted together on the knoll, and then she desisted and was still. And then came the bats, and a star that was like Ugh-lomi crept out of its blue hiding place in the west. She called to it, but softly, because she feared the lion, and all through the coming of the twilight the thicket was still. So the dark crept upon Eudena, and the moon he grew bright, and the shadows of things that had fled up the hillside and vanished with the evening came back to them short and black, and the dark shapes in the thicket of reeds and alders where the lion lay gathered, and a faint stir began there. But nothing came out therefrom all through the gathering of the darkness. Eudena looked at the squatting place and saw the fires glowing smoky red and the men and women going to and fro. The other way, over the river, a white mist was rising. Then far away came the whimpering of young foxes and the yell of a hyena. There were long gaps of aching waiting. After a long time, some animal splashed in the water and seemed to cross the river at the ford beyond the lair. But what animal it was, Eudena could not see. From the distant drinking pools, she could hear the sound of splashing and the noise of elephants. So still was the night. The earth was now a colorless arrangement of white reflections and impenetrable shadows under the blue sky. The silvery moon was already spotted with the filigree crests of the chestnut woods, and over the shadowy eastward hills the stars were multiplying. The knoll fires were bright red now, and black figures stood waiting against them. They were waiting for a scream. Surely it would be soon. The night suddenly seemed full of movement. Eudena held her breath. Things were passing. 1, 2, 3, subtly sneaking shadows. Jackals. And then a long waiting again. And then, asserting itself as real at once over all the sounds her mind had imagined, came a stir in the thicket, and then a vigorous movement. There was a snap. The reeds crashed heavily, once, twice, thrice. Then everything was still, save a measured swishing. Eudena heard a low, tremulous growl, and then everything was still again. The stillness lengthened. Would it never end? She held her breath. She bit her lips to stop from screaming. And then something scuttled through the undergrowth. Her scream was involuntary. She did not hear the answering yell from the mound. Immediately the thicket woke up to a vigorous movement again. She saw the grass stems waving in the light of the setting moon, the alders swaying. She struggled violently, her last struggle. But nothing came towards her. A dozen monsters seemed rushing about in that little place for a couple of minutes. And then again came silence. The moon sank behind the distant chestnuts, and the night was dark. Then an odd sound, a sobbing, panting that grew faster and fainter. Yet another silence, and then dim sounds, and the grunting of some animal. Everything was still again. Far away eastwards an elephant trumpeted, and from the woods came a snarling and yelping that died away. In the long interval the moon shone out again, between the stems of the trees on the ridge, sending 2 great bars of light and a bar of darkness across the reedy waste. Then came a steady rustling, a splash, and the reeds swayed wider and wider apart, and at last they broke open, cleft from root to crest. The end had come. Eudena looked to see the thing that had come out of the reeds. For a moment it seemed certain, the great head and jaw she expected. And then it dwindled and changed. It was a dark, low thing that remained silent. But it was not the lion. It became still. Everything became still. She peered. It was like some gigantic frog, 2 limbs and a slanting body. Its head moved about, searching the shadows. A rustle, and it moved clumsily with a sort of hopping, and as it moved it gave a low groan. The blood rushing through her veins was suddenly joy. "Ugh-lomi," she whispered. The thing stopped. "Eudena," he answered softly with pain in his voice and peering into the alders. And then Ugh-lomi, for it was he, moved again and came out of the shadow beyond the reeds into the moonlight. All his body was covered with dark smears. Eudena saw he was dragging his legs, and that he gripped his axe, the first axe, in one hand. In another moment, he had struggled into the position of all fours and had staggered over to her. "The lion," he said in a strange mingling of exultation and anguish. "Wah-oo! I have slain a lion with my own hand, even as I slew the great bear." Ugh-lomi moved to emphasize his words, and suddenly broke off with a faint cry. And for a space he did not move. "Let me free," whispered Eudena. He answered her no words, but pulled himself up from his crawling attitude by means of the alder stem, and he hacked at her thongs with the sharp edge of his axe. She heard him sob at each blow. He cut away the thongs about her chest and arms, and then his hand dropped. His chest struck against her shoulder, and he slipped down beside her and lay still. But the rest of her release was easy now. Very hastily she freed herself. She made 1 step from the tree, and her head was spinning. Her last conscious movement was towards him. She reeled, and suddenly fell headlong beside him. Her hand fell upon his thigh. It was soft and wet. and gave way under her pressure. He cried out at her touch, and writhed and lay still again, with her hand upon him. Presently a dark, dog-like shape came very softly through the reeds. This stopped dead and stood sniffing, hesitated, and at last turned and slunk back into the shadows. Long was the time they remained there motionless, with the light of the setting moon shining on their limbs. Very slowly as the setting of the moon, did the shadow of the reeds towards the mound flow over them. Presently their legs were hidden, and Ugh-lomi was but a bust of silver. The shadow crept to his neck, crept over his face, and so at last the darkness of the night swallowed them up. The shadow became full of instinctive stirrings. There was a patter of feet, and a faint snarling, the sound of a blow. There was very little sleep that night for the women and children at the squatting place until they heard Eudena scream. But the men were weary and sat dozing. When Eudena screamed, they felt assured of their safety and hurried to get to the nearest places to the fire. The old woman laughed at the scream and laughed again because Sai, the little sister of Eudena, whimpered. Directly the dawn came, they were all alert and looking towards the alders. They could see that Eudena had been taken. They could not help feeling glad to think that Uya was appeased. But across the minds of the men, the thought of Ugh-lomi fell like a shadow. They could understand revenge, for the world was old in revenge. But they did not think of rescue. Suddenly a hyena fled out of the thicket and came galloping across the reed space. His muzzle and paws were dark-stained. At that sight, all the men shouted and clutched at throwing stones and ran towards him, for no animal is so pitiful a coward as a hyena by day. All men hated the hyena because he preyed on children and would come and bite one who was sleeping at the edge of the squatting place. And Cat's skin, throwing fair and straight, hit the brute shrewdly in the flank, whereat the whole tribe yelled with delight. With the noise they made, there came a flapping of wings from the lair of the lion, and the 3 white-headed vultures rose slowly and circled and came to rest amidst the branches of an alder overlooking the lair.
"Ah, our lord is abroad," said the old woman, pointing. "The vultures have their share of Eudena."
For a space they remained there. Then first one, then another dropped back into the thicket. Then over the eastern woods, and touching the whole world to life and color, poured, with the exultation of a trumpet blast, the light of the rising sun. At the sight of him, the children shouted, and clapped their hands together, and began to race off towards the water. Only little Sai lagged behind, and looked wonderingly at the alders, where she had seen the head of Eudena overnight. But Uya, the old lion, was not abroad, but at home, and he lay very still, and a little on one side. He was not in his lair, but a little way from it in a place of trampled grass. Under one eye was a little wound, the feeble little bite of the first axe. But all the ground beneath his chest was ruddy brown with a vivid streak, and in his chest was a hole that had been made by Ugh-lomi's stabbing spear. Along his side and at his neck the vultures had marked their claims, for so Ugh-lomi had slain him, lying stricken under his paw and thrusting haphazard at his chest. Ugh-lomi had driven the spear in with all his strength and stabbed the giant to the heart. And so it was the reign of the lion, of the second incarnation of Uya the Master, came to an end. From the knoll the bustle of preparation grew, the hacking of spears and throwing stones. None spake the name of Ugh-lomi for fear that it might bring him. The men were going to keep together, close together, in the hunting for a day or so, and their hunting was to be Ugh-lomi, lest instead he should come a-hunting them. But Ugh-lomi was lying very still and silent, just outside the lion's lair, and Eudena squatted beside him, with the ash spear, all smeared with lion's blood, gripped in her hand. The fight in the lion's thicket. Ugh-lomi lay still, his back against an alder. His thigh was a red mass terrible to see. No civilized man could have lived who had been so sorely wounded. But Eudena got him thorns to close his wound, and squatted beside him day and night, smiting the flies from him with a fan of reeds by day, and in the night threatening the hyenas who came too near with the first axe in her hand. And in a little while, Ugh-lomi began to heal. It was high summer, and there was no rain. Little food they had. During the first 2 days his wounds were open. In the low place where they hid there were no roots nor little beasts, and the stream with its water snails and fish was in the open, 100 yards away. Eudena could not go abroad by day for fear of the tribe, her brothers and sisters, nor by night for fear of the beasts, both on his account and hers. So they shared the lion with the vultures. There was a trickle of water nearby, and Eudena brought him plenty in her hands. Where Ugh-lomi lay was well hidden from the tribe by a thicket of alders, and all fenced about with bulrushes and tall reeds. The dead lion he had killed lay near his old lair in a place of trampled reeds 50 yards away, in sight through the reed stems, and the vultures fought each other for the choicest pieces and kept the jackals off him. Very soon a cloud of flies that looked like bees hung over him, and Ugh-lomi could hear their humming. And when Ugh-lomi's flesh was already healing, and it was not many days before that began, only a few bones of the lion remained scattered and shining white. Now, for the most part, Ugh-lomi sat still during the day, looking before him at nothing. Sometimes he would mutter of the horses and bears and lions, and sometimes he would beat the ground with the first axe and say the names of the tribe. He seemed to have no fear of bringing the tribe, for hours and hours together. But chiefly, Ugh-lomi slept, dreaming little because of his loss of blood and the slightness of his food. During the short summer night, both kept awake. All the while the darkness lasted, things moved about them, things they never saw by day. For some nights the hyenas did not come, and then one moonless night near a dozen came and fought for what was left of the lion. That night was a tumult of growling, and Ugh-lomi and Eudena could hear the bones snap in their teeth. But they knew the hyena dare not attack any creature alive and awake, so they were not greatly afraid. Of a daytime, Eudena would go along the narrow path the old lion had made in the reeds until she was beyond the bend, and then she would creep into the thicket and watch the tribe. She would lie close by the alders, where they had bound her to offer her up to the lion, and thence she could see them on the knoll by the fire, little and clear, as she had seen them that night. But she told Ugh-lomi little of what she saw, because she feared to bring them by their names, for so they believed in those days, that naming called. She saw the men prepare stabbing spears and throwing stones in the morning after Ugh-lomi had slain the lion, and go out to hunt him, leaving the women and the children on the knoll. Little they know how near he was, as they tracked off in a single file towards the hills, with Sis the tracker leading them. And she watched the women and children, after the men had gone, gathering fern fronds and twigs for the night fire, and the boys and girls running and playing together. But the very old woman made her feel afraid. After a long space towards noon, when most of the others were down at the stream by the bend, she came and stood on the hither side of the knoll, a gnarled brown figure, and gesticulated so that Eudena could scarce believe she was not seen. Eudena lay like a hare in its form, with shining eyes fixed on the bent witch away there, and presently she dimly understood. It was the lion the old woman was worshipping. Yes, the lion that Ugh-lomi had slain. And the next day the hunters came back weary, carrying a fawn, and Eudena watched the feast enviously. And then came a strange thing. She saw, distinctly she heard, the old woman shrieking and gesticulating and pointing towards her. She was afraid. She crept like a snake out of sight again. But presently curiosity overcame her, and she was back at her spying place. And as she peered, her heart stopped, for there were all the men, with their weapons in their hands, walking together towards her from the knoll. Eudena dared not move, lest her movement should be seen, but she pressed herself close to the ground. The sun was low. The golden light was in the faces of the men. She saw that they carried a piece of rich red meat, thrust through by an ashen stake. Presently they stopped.
"Ah, go on!"
screamed the old woman. Cat's skin grumbled, and they came on, searching the thicket with sun-dazzled eyes.
Here,
said Sis, and they took the ashen stake with the meat upon it and thrust it into the ground.
"Ooh-yah!"
cried Sis.
"Behold thy portion, and Ugh-lomi we have slain. Of a truth we have slain Ugh-lomi, ooh-yah. This day we slew Ugh-lomi, and tomorrow we will bring his body to you."
And the others repeated his words and confirmed his lie. They looked at each other, and behind them, and partly turned and began going back. At first they walked half-turned to the thicket. Then facing the mound they walked faster, looking over their shoulders, then faster. Soon they ran. It was a race at last until they were near the knoll. Then Sis, who was hindmost, was first to slacken his pace. The sunset passed, the twilight came, the fires glowed red against the hazy blue of the distant chestnut trees, and the voices over the mound were merry. Eudena lay scarcely stirring, looking from the mound to the meat and then to the mound. She was hungry, but she was also afraid. At last she crept back to Ugh-lomi. He looked round at the little rustle of her approach. His face was in shadow.
"Have you got me some food?"
he said. She said she could find nothing, but that she would seek further, and went back along the lion's path until she could see the mound again. But she could not bring herself to take the meat. She had the brute's instinct of a snare. Ah, yes, she felt very miserable. Then Eudena crept back at last towards Ugh-lomi and heard him stirring and moaning. She turned back to the mound again, and she saw something in the darkness near the stake, and peering, distinguished a jackal. In a flash, Eudena was brave and angry. She sprang up, cried out, and ran towards the offering. She stumbled and fell, and heard the growling of the jackal going off. When she arose, only the ashen stake lay on the ground. The meat was gone. So she went back to fast through the night with Ugh-lomi, and Ugh-lomi was angry with her because she had no food for him, but she told him nothing of the things she had seen. 2 more days passed, and they were near starving, when the tribe slew a horse. And then came the same ceremony, and a haunch was left on the ashen stake. But this time Eudena did not hesitate. By acting and words, she made Ugh-lomi understand, but he ate most of the food before he understood. Then he grew merry with his food.
I am Ouya, he said. "I am the lion. I am the great cave bear. I who was only Ugh-lomi. I am Wa'u the cunning. It is well that they should feed me, for presently I will kill them all."
Then Eudena's heart was light, and she laughed with him, and afterwards she ate what he had left of the horse flesh with gladness. After that it was that Ugh-lomi had a dream, and the next day he made Eudena bring him the lion's teeth and claws, so much of them as she could find, and hack him a club of alder, and he put the teeth and the claws very cunningly into the wood, so that the points were outward. Very long it took him, and he blunted 2 of the teeth, hammering them in, and was very angry, and threw the thing away. But afterwards he dragged himself to where he had thrown it, and finished it. A club of a new sort, set with teeth. That day there was more meat for them both, an offering to the lion from the tribe. It was one day, more than a hand's fingers of days, more than anyone had the skill to count, after Ugh-lomi had made the club, that Eudena, while he was asleep, was lying in the thicket watching the squatting place. Now there had been no meat for 3 days, and the old woman came and worshipped after her manner. Now while she worshipped, Eudena's little sister Sai and another, the child of the first girl Sis had loved, came over the knoll and stood regarding her skinny figure, and presently they began to mock her. Eudena found this entertaining, but suddenly the old woman turned on them quickly and saw them. For a moment she stood, and they stood motionless, and then with a shriek of rage she rushed towards them, and all 3 disappeared over the crest of the knoll. Presently the children reappeared among the ferns over the shoulder of the hill. Little Sai ran first, for she was an active girl, and the other child ran squealing with the old woman close upon her. And over the knoll came Sis, with a bone in his hand, and Bo and Catskin obsequiously behind him, each holding a piece of food. And they laughed aloud, and they shouted to see the old woman so angry. And with a shriek, the child was caught. The old woman set to work slapping the child, screaming. It was very good after-dinner fun for them. Little Si ran on a little way, and stopped at last between fear and curiosity. And suddenly came the mother of the child, with hair streaming, panting, and with a stone in her hand, and the old woman turned about like a wildcat. She was the equal of any woman, was the old chief of the fire-minders, in spite of her years. But before she could do anything, Sis shouted to her, and the clamor rose loud. Other shockheads came into sight. It seemed the whole tribe was at home and feasting. But the old woman dared not go on wreaking herself on the child Sis befriended. Nevertheless, it was a fine row. Everyone made noises and called names, even little Si. Abruptly the old woman let go of the child she had caught and made a swift run at Si, who had no friends. And Si, realizing her danger when it was almost upon her, with a faint cry of terror, made off headlong, not heeding whither she ran, straight to the lair of the lion. She swerved aside into the reeds presently, not realizing whither she went. But the old woman was a wonderful old woman, as active as she was spiteful, and she caught Si by the streaming hair within 30 yards of Eudena. All the tribe now was running down the knoll and shouting, ready to see the fun. And then something stirred in Eudena, and thinking all of little Si and nothing of her fear, she sprang up from her ambush and ran swiftly forward. The old woman did not see her, for she was busy beating little Si's face with her hand, beating with all her heart. And suddenly something hard and heavy struck her cheek. She went reeling, and she saw Eudena with flaming eyes and cheeks between her and little Si. She shrieked with astonishment and terror, and little Si, not understanding, set off towards the gaping tribe. They were quite close now, for the sight of Eudena had driven their fading fear of the lion out of their heads. In a moment Eudena had turned from the cowering old woman and overtaken Si. "Si!" she cried. "Si!" She caught the child up in her arms as it stopped, pressed the nail-lined face to hers, and turned about to run towards her lair, the lair of the old lion. The old woman stood waist-high in the reeds and screamed foul things in inarticulate rage, but did not dare to intercept her. And at the bend of the path, Eudena looked back and saw all the men of the tribe crying to one another, and Sis coming at a trot along the lion's trail. She ran straight along the narrow way through the reeds, to the shady place where Ugh-lomi sat with his healing thigh, just awakened by the shouting and rubbing his eyes. She came to him, a woman, with little Si in her arms. Her heart throbbed in her throat. "Ugh-lomi," she cried. "Ugh-lomi, the tribe comes." Ugh-lomi sat staring in stupid astonishment at her and Si. She pointed with Si in one arm. She sought among her feeble store of words to explain. She could hear the men calling. Apparently they had stopped outside. She put down Si, and she caught up the new club with the lion's teeth, and she put it into Ugh-lomi's hand and ran 3 yards and picked up the first axe. "Ah," said Ugh-lomi, waving the new club. And suddenly he perceived the occasion, and rolling over began to struggle to his feet. He stood, but clumsily. He supported himself by one hand against the tree, and just touched the ground gingerly with the toe of his wounded leg. In the other hand he gripped the new club. He looked at his healing thigh, and suddenly the reeds began whispering and ceased and whispered again, and coming cautiously along the track among the reeds, bending down, holding his fire-hardened stabbing stick of ash in his hand, appeared Sis. He stopped dead, and his eyes met Ugh-lomi's. At that, Ugh-lomi quite forgot he had a wounded leg. He stood firmly on both feet. Something trickled. He glanced down and saw a little gout of blood had oozed out along the edge of the healing wound. He rubbed his hand there to give him the grip of his club, and he fixed his eyes again on Sis. The fighting spirit now swiftly and suddenly overflowed. "Wah-oo!" he cried, and sprang forward. And Sis, still stooping and watchful, drove his stabbing stick up very quickly in an ugly thrust. It ripped Ugh-lomi's guarding arm, and the club came down in a counter that Sis was never to understand. He fell, as an ox falls to the pole axe, at Ugh-lomi's feet. To Bo, it seemed the strangest thing. He had a comforting sense of tall reeds on either side, and an impregnable rampart, Sis, between him and any danger. Snail Eater was close behind, and there was no danger there. He was prepared to shove behind and send Sis to death or victory. That was his place as second man. He saw the blunt of the spear Sis carried leap away from him, and suddenly a dull whack, and the broad back fell away forward, and he looked Ugh-lomi in the face over his prostrate leader. It felt to Bo as if his heart had fallen down a well. He had a throwing stone in one hand, and an ashen stabbing stick in the other. He did not live to the end of his momentary hesitation which one to use. Now Snail Eater was a much readier man, and besides, Bo did not fall forward as Sis had done, but gave at his knees and hips, crumpling up with the toothed club upon his head, smiting him down. The Snail Eater drove his spear forward swift and straight, and took Ugh-lomi in the muscle of the shoulder, and then he drove him hard with the smiting stone in his other, and shouting as he did so. The new club swished ineffectually through the reeds. Eudena saw Ugh-lomi come staggering back from the narrow path into the open space, tripping over Sis with a foot of ashen stake sticking out of him over his arm, and then the Snail Eater, whose name she had given, had his final injury from her, as his exultant face came out of the reeds after his spear. For she swung the first axe, swift and high, and hit him fair and square on the temple, and down he went on Sis at prostrate Ugh-lomi's feet. But before Ugh-lomi could get to his feet, the two red-haired men were tumbling out of the reeds, spears and smiting stones ready, and Snake hard behind them. One she struck on the neck, but not to fell him, and he blundered aside and spoilt his brother's blow at Ugh-lomi's head. In a moment Ugh-lomi dropped his club and had his assailant by the waist and had pitched him sideways sprawling. He snatched at his club again and recovered it. The man Eudena had hit stabbed at her with his spear as he stumbled from her blow, and involuntarily she gave ground to avoid him. He hesitated between her and Ugh-lomi, half-turned, gave a vague cry at finding Ugh-lomi so near, and in a moment Ugh-lomi had him by the throat, and the club had its third victim. As he went down, Ugh-lomi shouted, no words, but an exultant cry. The other red-haired man was 6 feet from her with his back to her and a darker red streaking his head. He was struggling to his feet. She had an irrational impulse to stop his rising. She flung the axe at him, missed, saw his face in profile, and he had swerved beyond Little Si, was running through the reeds. She had a transitory vision of Snake standing in the throat of the path, half turned away from her, and then she saw his back. She saw the club whirling through the air, and the shock head of Ugh-lomi, with blood in the hair and blood upon the shoulder, vanishing below the reeds in pursuit. And then she heard Snake scream. She ran past Si to where the handle of the axe stuck out of a clump of fern, and turning found herself panting and alone with 3 motionless bodies. The air was full of shouts and screams. For a space she was sick and giddy, and then it came into her head that Ugh-lomi was being killed along the reed path, and with an inarticulate cry she leapt over the body of Bo and hurried after him. Snake's feet lay across the path, and his head was among the reeds. She followed the path until it bent round and opened out by the alders, and thence she saw all that was left of the tribe in the open, scattering like dead leaves before a gale, and going back over the knoll. Ugh-lomi was hard upon Catskin now, but Catskin was fleet of foot and got away, and so did young Wa'ohu when Ugh-lomi turned upon him, and Ugh-lomi pursued Wa'ohu far beyond the knoll before he desisted. He had the rage of battle on him now, and the wood thrust through his shoulder stung him like a spear. When she saw he was in no danger, she stopped running and stood panting, watching the distant active figures run up and vanish one by one over the knoll. In a little time, she was alone again. Everything had happened very swiftly. The smoke of Brother Fire rose straight and steady from the squatting place, just as it had done 10 minutes ago, when the old woman had stood yonder worshipping the lion. And after a long time, as it seemed, Ugh-lomi reappeared over the knoll and came back to Eudena, triumphant and breathing heavily. She stood, her hair about her eyes and hot-faced, with the blood-stained axe in her hand, at the place where the tribe had offered her as a sacrifice to the lion. "Wah-oo-ah!" cried Ugh-lomi. At the sight of her, his face alight with the fellowship of battle, and he waved his new club, red now and hairy, and at the sight of his glowing face her tense pose relaxed somewhat, and she stood weeping and rejoicing. Ugh-lomi had a queer, unaccountable pang at the sight of her tears, but he only shouted, "Wah-oo-ah!" all the louder, and shook the axe east and west. He called to her to follow him and turned back, striding with the club swinging in his hand towards the squatting place, as if he had never left the tribe. And Eudena stopped weeping and followed. So Ugh-lomi and Eudena came back to the squatting place from which they had fled many days before from the face of Uya. And by the squatting place lay a deer half-eaten, just as there had been before Ugh-lomi was man or Eudena woman. So Ugh-lomi sat down to eat, and Eudena beside him, and the rest of the tribe watched them from safe hiding places. And after a time one of the elder girls came back timorously and carrying little Sai in her arms, and Eudena called to them by name and offered them food. But the elder girl was afraid and would not come, though Sai struggled to come to Eudena. Afterwards, when Ugh-lomi had eaten, he sat dozing, and at last he slept. And slowly the others came out of the hiding places and drew near. And when Ugh-lomi woke, save that there were no men to be seen, it seemed as though he had never left the tribe. Now, there's a thing strange but true, that all through this fight Ugh-lomi forgot that he was lame, and was not lame. And after he had rested, behold, he was lame man, and he remained a lame man until the end of his days. Catskin and the second red-haired man, and Wah-wah-hoo, who chipped flints cunningly, as his father had done before him, fled from the face of Ugh-lomi, and none knew where they hid. But 2 days after, they came, and they squatted among the bracken under the chestnuts a good way off from the knoll, and watched. Ugh-lomi's rage had gone. He moved to go against them, and did not. And at sundown they went away. That day, too, they found the old woman among the ferns, where Ugh-lomi had blundered upon her when he had pursued Wah-wah-hoo. She was dead, and more ugly than ever, but whole. The jackals and vultures had tried her, and left her. Oh, she was ever a wonderful old woman. The next day the 3 men came again and squatted nearer, and Wah-wah-hoo had 2 rabbits to hold up, and the red-haired man a wood pigeon, and Ugh-lomi stood before their women and mocked them. The next day they came and they sat again nearer, without stones or sticks, and with the same offerings, and Catskin had a trout. Now, it was rare men caught fish in those days, but Catskin would stand silently in the water for hours and catch them with his hand. And the 4th day Ugh-lomi suffered these 3 to come to the squatting place in peace, with the food they had with them. Ugh-lomi ate the trout, and thereafter, for many moons, Ugh-lomi was master, and had his will in peace. And on the fullness of time, he was killed and eaten as Uya had been slain. You've just heard The Stone Age by H.G. Wells. Thank you for listening to StoryLink Radio. If you like what you've just heard, we hope you will subscribe to our podcast and pass along our web address, www.storylinkradio.com. Be sure to visit our website for show notes, to find out how to join our live audience, and for lots of free stuff, including free audiobooks and much more. Join us next time for another story from StoryLink Radio.